This project started out when the census released its data in 2010, and we were looking at the impact of the recession on Colorado. And what we found was, overall, was a big increase in poverty. And when we drilled down, we found that almost the entire increase in poverty rates in Colorado had taken place among the Latino and African American families. And so we wondered, how long has this been going on? And so we started going back decade by decade, and we got to 1980, and we saw that the gaps were wider today than they were back in 1980. And so we decided, let's look at what happened before and after the civil rights movement. And so we went back, did the brain damage to look at the hard-to-read charts from the census in 1960 and 1970, and found an amazing sort of pattern emerge. Let me just scroll down for a second. Where, for example, for median family income, we found that for Colorado, between 1960 and 1970, the income gaps actually narrowed during the civil rights era. So at that point in time, both African American and Latino families were earning a little more than 70% of what white families were earning. But then, as you can see, the gaps keep getting wider and wider. So today, Latino families are earning about 50% of what white families are earning, and African American families are earning a little more than 60%. If you look at home ownership, you can see a similar pattern where you saw there in 1970 the gaps narrow. So in fact, the white rate actually went down slightly and the African American and Latino rate went up. But now you flash forward to today, and you can see it's below 50% for both Latinos and blacks, and almost 70% for whites. And then the most alarming one from our standpoint was the college gaps, where you can see here that the gap is just almost a straight line. There's sort of a slight narrowing in 1970, but almost a straight line widening today. And as you saw in the video, there is no state in the United States that has larger gaps in college graduation between the three groups than the state of Colorado. Not a single one. The one area where we did see some gains was in high school graduation rates. So again, if you look, you can see that there has been a narrowing of the gaps from 1960, both in Colorado and the United States, so that 95% of white adults have high school degrees, 86% of African American adults. Latino is 65%, but it is on the ascent. It is rising, type of thing. And then we looked at, and let me introduce Kevin Bond over here and Jim Trotter, who both worked on the series, and Pat Kelly, who helped arrange this, all from iNews. Kevin looked at the health disparities, and we saw similar trends where the infant mortality rates were so much higher among Latinos and African Americans than among whites, and a lot of other health indicators. So the question that we had was, why? Why did this occur? And so we talked to probably around a little over 40 people from across the U.S. and in Colorado. And what emerged was probably one of the most complex social phenomena that has occurred in the last 4 or 5 decades. So many different things were occurring at the same time in both Colorado and the United States. For one, a lot of the affirmative action policies had gone by the wayside. They were being de-emphasized. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court is taking up the Voting Rights Act right now, type of thing. At the same time, manufacturing jobs were disappearing at a very fast rate. And what we had found was that manufacturing jobs for a lot of minority families were the entrance into middle class. People could earn the equivalent of $60,000 to $70,000 today. They could easily buy their own home, afford even a second home. But those jobs disappeared, and those jobs did not require high school degrees, much less college degrees. And so, for example, we looked at Pueblo closely with the CF&I plant, and we found not only did the jobs disappear, but a whole generation of youth had grown up in households thinking that because they'd seen their parents with high-paying manufacturing jobs and no high school or college degrees, that they didn't have to have that to get into the middle class. So that was taking place. There was also a very quick rise in single-parent households headed by women raising children among both Latino and African-American families. That was taking place at the same time. And as someone told Kevin, the math is very simple. If you got two incomes in a household, that's going to be a lot higher than one income in a household as far as staying out of poverty and getting up into the middle class. At the same time, there were things happening in Colorado that were really impacting the education gaps and some of the single-family parent household gaps. For one, state spending for K through 12 education fell from about midway point among the states to among the bottom 5 or 6. And one of the most recent reports has that only 3 other states in the United States spend less per pupil for public higher education than Colorado. So that funding has gone down. At the same time that funding has gone down, tuition rates have gone up. So it's been a double whammy for families that are teetering on the middle class to begin with, type of thing. We also looked at incarceration rates, and in the 1980s, Colorado beefed up drug laws and prison terms. And so what we found was by the 1990s, 1 out of every 20 black males was in prison, 1 out of every 50 Latino males was in prison, and for whites it was 1 out of 150. Those Latino and black rates were higher than the national averages, type of thing. So you have all of these things happening at once. People, the people we talked to disagree on which one was the most important, which one was the driving force. People will point their finger at welfare reform on both sides of the political aisle, type of thing. There was a sense from a lot of the community leaders that there would have been a loss of communities in a lot of these neighborhoods. That the community would rally around people in need back in the 60s and 70s, and that had been lost over the decades. And that the neighborhoods were a little more fractured than they are today. So I know that's a lot to go over in a very short period of time, but that's generally the outline of what we found.